"You're George, right? The one who used to run training." That's what the new hire asked me as I was digging printer toner out of a cardboard box at 7:42 in the morning on a Tuesday. Not Director Vance. Just George, like I was some faded office fixture nobody had mentioned to him. I smiled. Still do, depending on who you ask. 12 years. That's how long I'd been building this company's spine, hiring protocols, onboarding systems, and training ladders. I wrote the employee handbook and established the original hiring framework before human resources even knew what an organizational chart was or how to run a proper screening. And now I was squatting next to a supply cabinet, getting mistaken for the help. Welcome to people development, the department no one remembers until morale craves or a lawsuit shows up. I didn't need applause. Watching executives I trained promote each other over drinks, while I got birthday cupcakes in the break room, is a specific flavor of humility. I stayed because I believed training wasn't overhead. It was legacy. Turns out legacy doesn't fit on a balance sheet, but layoffs do. The joke started in year 5. George is a lifer, king of the onboarding jungle. Don't mess with him. I smiled through it. Let them think I was the harmless office uncle who brought donuts and laminated sign-in sheets. Let them forget I had access to every executive's file. Let them overlook the equity clause I'd negotiated back in the dinosaur days, when our founding chief executive officer still used Hotmail and begged us to take equity instead of cash bonuses. I kept mine quietly. By year 8, they stopped joking and just forgot I was in the room. Meetings went from let's loop in George to who owns training again. I watched 5 bosses cycle through above me, all of them some flavor of young, ambitious climbers obsessed with key performance indicators and culture upgrades. All of them temporary. I outlasted them like mold on an office coffee mug. In year 10, I stopped waiting to be seen and started investing in myself. I spent weekends on Zoom with governance consultants. I hired a career strategist out of my own pocket and paid for an executive leadership program. They thought I was trying to find myself. They weren't wrong. The real find was a clause buried in my original agreement. A right of first refusal on any voting structure changes, signed when we had fewer than 50 employees. A clause the current board forgot existed. By year 12, I was the institutional wallpaper, the person you blame when Slack stops syncing or a training video has a typo. I said nothing when they brought in that new chief financial officer with a startup ego and a yacht on Instagram. I said even less when he quietly snuck a strategic advisory fee into our annual training budget to cover his own expenses. But I logged every invoice, every receipt, and every training hour mocked in leadership huddles. I smiled because we don't scream when the fire starts. We just pull the fireproof files, check the bylaws, and start rewriting the ending. The new chief executive officer, Stephen Abbott, arrived in a hurricane of LinkedIn quotes and cologne. The board practically kneeled before him. Disruptive leadership, they called it. Translation: younger, louder, completely untethered from the soul of the company. Then came Brandon Croft. Brandon strutted in 3 days later, a full 28 years old with a Harvard business degree and the emotional intelligence of a cheese grater. His title was Chief of Strategy Implementation. His mission was to slash, burn, and optimize. His favorite phrase was legacy overhead. I became fluent in Brandon within a week. He held a culture reorganization meeting where he replaced all department names with sleek new acronyms. People development was now human potential excellence, or some nonsense like that. My team looked at me like scared interns on the Titanic. I didn't have the heart to tell them. We'd already hit the iceberg. 2 weeks later, my calendar went from standing meetings with department heads to syncs with interns. My budget requests went unanswered. My Slack permissions were downgraded without explanation. Then came the email from Brandon's assistant, titled Updated Role Scope, Urgent Signature Needed. The document was 2 pages of legal language dressed up in marketing perfume. Somewhere in the middle was the bombshell. My authority over training, onboarding, and interdepartmental policy development would be transferred to strategic ops for streamlined oversight. In other words, I was being turned into a mascot, a smiling figurehead for a program they'd already hollowed out. I read the document twice, laughed once, then forwarded it to a lawyer I knew on retainer. She responded with one line, "Don't sign." Not yet. Behind closed doors, Brandon turned colder by the day. In meetings, he'd interrupt me mid-sentence with, "Let's keep this future-facing." If I mentioned past outcomes, he'd say, "We're not a museum." He once leaned across the table during a quarterly review and said, "Brilliant at creating systems, George. But systems get stale. We need lean energy now." I smiled and sipped my tea. The team I'd mentored for years was scattered overnight. One was transferred to a product role. Another was invited to take a lateral move into the supply chain. One was just gone, like he evaporated in the break room. I wasn't even told until I saw his mug still sitting in the dishwasher a week later. The final straw came when they moved my desk. Not just figuratively, but literally. My corner office with the glass walls, the one with the fake fern I'd kept alive for a decade, was reassigned to a new consultant named Clara Mercer, who specialized in return on investment accountability. I was given a workstation near the communal printer. No door, no fake fern, just toner fumes and a view of the hallway where Brandon Croft marched past daily like a hall monitor in some prestige television drama. He stopped once, leaned on my desk, and said, "I hope you're not too attached to titles, George. We are all fluid now, just part of the stream." I looked up from my clutter, kept my voice steady, and said, "I have never needed a fancy title to do real damage, Brandon." He grinned, thinking I was joking. That was the moment when the last bit of confusion vanished. The hurt hardened into something useful. What replaced it was a dull, deliberate focus. I had seen boys like this before. They think office politics is a game of chess, but they play like toddlers, flipping the board when they start to lose. What they did not realize is that I built this board. I knew which tiles were glued down and which ones triggered the trap door. I did not raise my voice, and I did not cry in the parking lot. I simply called an old friend in the legal department who owed me 2 favors and a bottle of expensive wine. Then I started reading the company bylaws again, closely, line by line, highlighting anything that looked outdated. It turned out the foundation Brandon wanted to bulldoze had been built with more than bricks and email templates. It had roots, and it had teeth. And I was done playing nice. I first noticed the repackaging of the financials when a monthly summary landed in my inbox. It read like it had been run through a corporate salad spinner. Line items that used to say leadership coaching or compliance training were now condensed under vague buckets like operational support flow and intangible non-client-facing resources. It was a financial word soup, and the ladle stirring it belonged to Brandon. The kicker was that my name was still all over the original approval chains. Every line now labeled non-essential or discretionary had once passed through my hands, back when the company still believed developing people was worth more than slapping slogans on coffee mugs. And now those expenses were being turned into ammunition against me. A week later, I got a polite email from the audit review and risk team asking for clarification on several entries dating back 3 fiscal years. 3 years. It was as if I was hoarding gold bars in the training room ceiling tiles. There was no copy to Brandon, but let us be honest. His scent was all over that email. They wanted details on why I approved a series of one-on-one coaching sessions with a leadership consultant and whether it was justified. The executive that consultant trained now ran the European region. Another successfully negotiated our largest vendor contract. Yet they debated my $1,400 invoice while Brandon greenlit 6 figures for his data synergy acceleration pod, which was just a rented office with a beanbag chair and a guy named Troy. I did not answer the email right away. Instead, I started printing receipts, approval chains, meeting notes, and slide decks with Brandon's name stamped on projects that used frameworks I designed 2 years earlier. I dusted off an old flash drive I used to joke was my burn-it-all-down stick and started organizing. The cherry on top was a quarterly budget deck I found buried in our shared drive, stripped of my metadata but featuring my original formatting and talking points word for word. Someone had just replaced the footer and slapped his own name on it. Brandon had never met a mirror he did not love. That weekend, at my lake house with no internet or Slack pings, I used 2 legal pads and 3 bottles of wine to list every budget Brandon touched. I cross-referenced them against legacy expenditures, highlighting every deviation and renamed category. The pattern was clear. He was erasing institutional memory, mine especially, replacing it with spreadsheets no one would question until something broke. When I asked Human Resources to confirm my official title for an external partner, the clerk on the line got quiet and told me she would get back to me. That was when I knew the gears were turning behind the scenes. My lawyer advised me to preserve every email and document. If they were building a paper trail, I had to build one too, but smarter. The next morning, my nameplate was replaced with Advisor of Talent Continuity. I was not told. I laughed, slipped the plate into my bag, and let them file it under non-essential. That afternoon, Sarah Miller, a marketing manager, stopped me in the stairwell. She nervously showed me a Slack thread on her phone from a private strategy channel. It said, "Finalize the package and schedule the termination before the fourth quarter kickoff, preferably Friday. Avoid legacy noise." Another message asked how to shut off access post-meeting to ensure JV did not catch wind early. I handed the phone back. Sarah nodded and left. I stood in the stairwell, realizing they were preparing to erase me. They called me in at 9:01 in the morning sharp on Friday. That is how cowards operate. Early enough to avoid office gossip. Late enough that someone else handles the fallout. The calendar invite was titled Fourth Quarter Strategic Realignment Touchpoint, which was corporate speak, for we are about to bury you with a smile. I did not bring my laptop or a notebook. Just a fountain pen I liked. Black ink, sharp nib. The weight of it felt correct for the moment. Brandon Croft sat at the head of the glass conference room, like a villain auditioning for a tech drama. Blue suit, no socks, ankles exposed as if he had personally defeated traditional footwear. A human resources representative sat beside him, arms folded, a printed packet on the table with my name in bold 14-point font. "George," Brandon said, motioning to the seat across from him. "Thanks for coming in." I did not sit. Brandon sighed dramatically. "We have concluded your role no longer aligns with our strategic direction. Effective immediately, your position is being eliminated." The representative slid the packet across the table. It made that low, whispery sound of paper meeting paper. "Of course," Brandon added, "this is no reflection on your past contributions, but there have been questions about some expenditures. Vanity certifications and personal coaching sessions billed as team development. We will skip the legal jargon. Bottom line, it is a misuse of funds. The company is being generous here, considering." That word vanity sat there, daring me to react. I did not. Instead, I uncapped my pen and signed the acknowledgement page. One clean signature at the bottom, no hesitation. I slid the packet back, then reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my security badge, and placed it on the table so gently, it looked like reverence. "Do what you must," I said quietly. "I look forward to formally introducing myself at Monday's board meeting." I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and let the words hang in the air. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Brandon blinked. "I am sorry, what board meeting?" I just smiled, showing no teeth and offering no explanation. Just that soft, haunting smile that people remember in their dreams and therapy sessions. The representative looked up like she had missed a memo, and Brandon looked down, as if he suddenly remembered something he had not read. I turned and walked out without another word. Right outside the glass doors stood two security officers. One was tall and silent, the other was Daniel. He had been on the night shift for 5 years before getting promoted, and I had written his recommendation letter. Daniel nodded once and held the elevator door open. "Mr. Vance," he said, and then lowered his voice. "This is wrong. You deserved better." I paused and looked him in the eye. "I did, Daniel, but I will settle for justice," he smirked. "You always land on your feet, sir." I did not answer, just kept walking. Past the elevator, past the fake succulents, past the hallway where Brandon's pet project poster still hung. I walked straight out of the building with no boxes, no tears, and no slow-motion glances back. Outside, the autumn air bit through my coat like a dare. I inhaled deeply. There is a particular kind of cold that wakes you up, not in your bones, but in your blood. It is the chill of war drums and overdue retribution humming beneath your ribs. I did not go home. I went straight to a cafe across town and sat in the same corner booth where I had met the board chair, Walter Henderson, 6 months earlier. We had sat there for hours, reviewing the company bylaws line by line and preparing for a day just like this. I opened my leather folio. Inside were 3 things: a signed and notarized voting proxy, a shareholder motion drafted by counsel, and a schedule for Monday's board meeting. I ordered coffee, black. Then I texted Walter, "All set, Let us make it clean. He replied within 60 seconds. See you Monday, Interim Chief Executive Officer. I took a long sip. My smile returned, and this time it reached my eyes. By the time I got home on Friday night, the shock had worn off. I walked straight to my home office, flicked on the lamp, and stared at the locked drawer that had waited for this moment longer than Brandon had probably been shaving. The key was hidden in my leather wallet, taped behind an expired gift card. I pulled it out, my hand perfectly steady, slid it into the brass lock and twisted. The drawer opened with a soft metallic sigh. Inside were 6 file folders. The first was labeled Voting Rights Legacy Clause. Inside was the original agreement from 11 years ago, signed by the founding chief executive officer and 2 original board members. That clause granted me the right to amend and co-sign governance policies in lieu of cash bonuses. No expiration, no exceptions, no non-disclosure agreement. They had forgotten it existed. I never did. The second folder held my shareholder holdings confirmations. My stake was 34.1%. Add in 2 trusted allies, both former C-suite members I had mentored over the years, and we controlled just north of 51%. Majority rule, silent, patient, and now legally binding. Folder 3 was my favorite. It was labeled Vanity Expenses. Brandon had mocked my budget lines as if I was collecting beads at a carnival. But those funds had gone to a corporate governance mentor in Washington, private sessions with a legal strategist specializing in succession law, and a director boot camp that walked me through exactly how to dismantle a hostile executive structure without raising my voice. Every dime was approved, documented, and tied to legal protocols, merger preparation, or leadership succession. My training program was never about onboarding rookies. It was about preparing for this exact war. The 4th folder held the bylaws revisions and board approval. Walter and I had started the draft 9 months ago under the guise of modernizing operations. We buried it under operational redundancy mitigation, a phrase nobody questioned. We redefined quorum voting procedures and shifted the power of executive oversight to any shareholder majority coalition should one arise in response to leadership misalignment. Guess what? One just had. Folder 5 contained the Monday meeting agenda, drafted, signed, and filed. I was on the docket. Line 2, Leadership Clause Invocation, presented by G. Vance, equity partner. That meant I had the right to call a vote on a motion of no confidence. The Sull folder was empty except for a sticky note that read, Phase 2. I smiled and closed the drawer. Monday morning, the office buzzed with caffeine jitters. Someone had set out muffins in the boardroom. The board was already seated by 8:55, all smiles and shoulder claps. Stephen Abbott, the chief executive officer, was chatting with Walter Henderson about their weekend golf game, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. Clara Mercer, the newly hired consultant who was now occupying my old corner office, adjusted her designer blazer and kept nodding at everything Stephen said. Brandon Croft stood by the digital projector, looking like he had personally cured national debt in his spare time. Third quarter growth was explosive, Brandon began, his voice slick. Net growth is up 9.2%, and we have restructured training for leaner efficiency. Departmental overhead is down 40%. He did not say my name. It was not necessary. I was the overhead. Looking ahead to the 4th quarter, we are building momentum with new hires and vendor negotiations. Before we continue, Walter Henderson interrupted, his voice slicing through the room like a cold breeze. There is one matter we must address first. Brandon blinked. What item? Walter did not answer. Instead, he turned his head toward the side door, and I walked in. I wore my Navy suit and carried my black folio. 3 board members straightened in their seats, exchanging quick, puzzled glances. Clara's jaw dropped, her pen slipping from her hand onto the glass table. Brandon did not turn fully. He pivoted just enough to register my presence, trying to look bored but failing to hide the twitch in his jaw. George, he said, this is unexpected. Not for everyone, I replied, laying my black leather folio on the table. Good morning, gentlemen. Walter did not introduce me. He simply cleared his throat and said, per procedural update section 12C, effective today, any equity partner holding a qualifying voting block may present a motion at the opening of the session. Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it. I caught the micro-expression as his brain tried to process every email he had skimmed and every meeting with legal he had declined. I continued. Under that clause, and as a recognized equity partner, I am exercising that right. I motion for an immediate review of departmental restructuring outcomes, budget relocations, and executive consulting approvals in the second and third quarters. The General Counsel, Diana Proctor, nodded. The motion is within rights and procedures. Brandon forced a chuckle, though his voice sounded thin and strained. With respect, I do not think we need to rehash ancient spending. We have moved forward. We are streamlined and focused on future growth. Walter folded his hands on the table, his expression completely blank. Efficiency without compliance is a liability, Brandon. Let us continue. Brandon sat down slowly, finally understanding he was no longer running the room. I opened my folio. Inside were annotated copies of budget approvals, training session outcomes, and board-ratified expense policies, all signed, dated, and legally binding. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply handed out the documents to each board member. Brandon looked over one of the pages. His smile faltered. He scanned the room for a lifeline, and then I saw the moment he finally realized the truth. I had never left. I had been moving sideways underneath, quietly reshaping the foundation he thought he stood on. As of 9:07 in the morning, the bylaws I co-wrote were the rules. Walter looked down the row. Motion accepted, he said. We will proceed with the review and voting. There was no applause, just paper shuffling and Brandon trying not to sweat through his expensive jacket. But I was not angry anymore. I was in position, exactly where I was meant to be. I watched the board members leaf through the files. Each page was a testament to the fact that while Brandon was playing short-term political games, I had been building a long-term corporate fortress. Every signature from the founding era was laid bare, confirming my permanent authority. I could see the sweat beads forming on his forehead. The air in the boardroom had that sharp, brittle quiet. I spoke clearly, slowly, with the surgical calm of someone explaining a math problem to a child. Let us begin with the itemized breakdown, I said, sliding a binder forward. Every flagged expense related to my tenure as Director of People Development is cataloged here, cross-referenced with board-approved budgets and signed authorizations. I glanced at Diana Proctor, who gave a small nod. Brandon Croft cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. These trainings, he said, his voice tight, were not disclosed in full detail. That is what raised concerns. Incorrect, I replied, flipping to tab 3. Each training was pre-approved under the Operational Growth Initiative of 2017, extended via Clause 14B. See the signatures from former Chief Financial Officer Charles Jenkins, former Chairwoman Helen, and myself. I handed out the supporting documents. Brandon did not reach for them, but Clara Mercer did. Her eyes moved fast, I continued. Page 9 details external consultant partnerships, including the legal strategist I retained to advise on governance infrastructure. Also, note the training hours logged match the outcomes that led to 3 strategic hires and 2 major vendor transitions. If we are redefining value, let us be consistent. Then I opened the next folder, the one that held the real teeth of the investigation. Now let us pivot, I said, sliding new, freshly printed pages forward. Let us look at Brandon's consulting expenditures. Specifically, the allocation labeled for the second quarter, Performance Architecture Advisor, which was a $27,000 line item paid to a firm called Perform Group LLC. Walter Henderson narrowed his eyes. I do not recall approving that vendor. Neither did legal, I said, and neither did finance. Diana, would you please confirm? Diana Proctor leaned forward. The company has no record of Perform Group in our approved vendor list, nor does it appear in compliance archives. Brandon's face turned a peculiar shade of pale. I held up a page from the State Business Registry. Perform Group LLC is registered to Timothy Thorne. That name matches the email domain of Brandon's college roommate. Timothy also appears in photos from Brandon's 10-year college reunion. Brandon opened his mouth. Before you say it was an arm's-length transaction, I added. Timothy's email signature matches a domain created 3 days before the first invoice, and he was paid via expedited wire, bypassing the usual review chain. Diana turned to Brandon, her expression dark. I leaned back in my chair. To review, I spent company funds on authorized, board-approved leadership development programs. Brandon, on the other hand, spent company funds on an unvetted shell firm, owned by his college roommate. to create a performance architecture report that was mostly plagiarized from a 2018 consulting white paper. Under corporate law, this constitutes self-dealing and a direct breach of the duty of loyalty and fiduciary duty. An officer cannot direct corporate opportunities or assets to a personal associate without full disclosure and disinterested board approval. By doing so, he violated his legal duty to act in the best interests of the company. I tapped the final packet of slides. Highlighted in bright yellow are the exact sentences, lifted word for word from the original white paper. No one moved. The silence was deafening. Even the muffins on the table seemed embarrassed. Brandon stared at his hands. I folded mine. "You said I wasted money on training, Brandon," I said. "It turns out I was preparing for your job." Walter Henderson laughed, a full chest laugh, then looked at his watch. "Well then," he said, "shall we move to the motion?" Walter closed the folder. "We have heard the facts and reviewed the documentation. I would like to proceed with a motion of no confidence in Chief of Strategy Implementation Brandon Croft and Chief Executive Officer Stephen Abbott based on findings of unauthorized financial disbursements, vendor misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty." The General Counsel nodded. The remaining voting members may now raise their hands one by one. Hands rose. The CFO, Diana, and the board members. The motion carried. Brandon stood slowly, muttering that this could not be binding, but Walter cut him off. "You are no longer with this company, Brandon." Stephen Abbott sat in stunned silence, realizing his support had vanished. Brandon walked out, his expensive suit rumpled, his legacy in ruins. Walter turned to the board. "Per revised bylaws, we must appoint an interim chief executive officer." Diana spoke first. "We need someone with internal structural knowledge, compliance experience, and a proven track record." Walter looked at me. "George, would you be willing to serve as interim chief executive officer?" I did not answer immediately. The victory was in knowing I did not have to ask. Effective immediately, Walter announced, "George Vance will step in as interim chief executive officer." No one objected. I stood and gathered my documents, looking at Brandon, who had burst back into protest, only to be escorted out by Daniel. I walked down the hallway, past Clara's desk, and entered the office that was now mine. I sat down at the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the red folder labeled Succession Plan Phase 2. I whispered to the empty room, "You are the real stars of the corporate jungle. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe or I will flick the switch on your old cubicle memories."